And I actually think Kevin's going to start out here, but appreciate you all joining us, and let's get rolling here.
Great. So we're going to jump right in and talk about sort of the themes and thoughts of the May revise. And this first point about is there good news is a sort of legitimate question, because if you look at the governor's overall budget numbers and the total dollar amounts that materialize at the May revise, it kind of goes against what a lot of people were anticipating, including us, frankly, where we thought there would be more revenue. And then within a day or two, the legislative analysts came out with their view that indeed, in their estimation, there will be what I consider to be a significant amount of additional revenue, almost double what the governor projects, and certainly enough to do some of the initiatives that we were hoping to see at the May revise that the governor did not include because his numbers suggested there was less money. We're going to get into the numbers in a little bit. But the other, theme that the governor continues is basically his MO of trying to restrain spending by being very conservative on overall dollars. Then the third point is something that we've warned about all along, which is that if we take a look at LCFF and we look at what the long-term sort of trajectory of school funding under Prop 98, the combination of the two promises year-over-year growth for a long time. We've suggested that any number of things could get in the way of that. And before even the end of the first year, we have our biggest threat, which is the governor's announcement that he wants to have school districts participate in retiring this unfunded obligation in STRS. We have a number of slides that cover that. It really is the centerpiece, I think, of the issues that affect K-12 schools in this May revise. For the most part, beyond that little detail in his rainy day fund, which we'll talk a little bit more about, the overall plan for K-12 is really unchanged. The governor doesn't change it that much. Then for the overall budget proposal, there you can see here with this slide, overall revenues, governor has at $2.4 billion, not a bad overall figure, but when you take a look at what we get in schools, and we'll talk about that under the Prop 98 slides. This big bullet, this big point here that I made earlier, a 32-year plan to tackle the STRS liability, obviously a major piece. His rainy day fund, something thematically he's talked about now for a couple of months. His own imprint on rainy day fund and savings. It comes along with a Prop 98 reserve, which is sort of a new dimension on this whole idea of a rainy day fund that we see. It's an echo from what he did at January, but he's really in the mode of campaigning hard in the legislative process right now for that. We have a number of slides that talk about the rainy day fund specifically. Increases in overall Prop 98 spending, but you see it's a very small dollar amount over January. One of the things that he noted in his press conference that he had was that since January, there's been $1 billion increase in Medi-Cal costs attributable to what they're trying to do in terms of health care and participation sign-ups for what is the California version of the Affordable Care Act. And then finally, he does have a modest drought response effort in the budget. That's a pretty good overview of what the overall budget looks like.
So one point I wanted to make as well is, and we're going to get back to it, Kevin's going to talk a lot more on Prop 98, but remember in 13-14 and even 12-13, when revenues were up significantly, Prop 98 saw most of that gain. So we got more than our share of the increase in revenues in those years. You look at this year, 14-15, and revenues are up by $2.4 billion, but we get only about 10% of that. That is a big change that we'll talk about a little later, and that's why it's not as good news as we would have hoped.
So here's a chart that looks at the governor's revenue assumption, and we sort of call your attention to the red text down below, which shows you the difference. So the governor across every one of these major revenue pieces, from personal income taxes, sales and use tax, and the corporate tax, which we call the big three, you can see overall revenue estimates there and what they do in the out years. And we're going to be focusing on the difference from the legislative analyst's office in terms of what they see. And there's pretty big implications for what might be spendable money, not just in the current year, but big time next year. Here's a focus on the actual assumptions between the two offices. One of the things that was typically sort of an axiom around the Capitol building in prior years is that the legislature would look for whichever was the better economic scenario and try to go with that. That was particularly true during the really difficult years. If the legislative analyst came up with a forecast that was better than Department of Finance's, there was a tendency to want to go with that because it gave them the most room to avoid deeper cuts and to basically have a little less difficulty in terms of the political decisions that need to be made. This time around, though, it might be different because we saw this last year where, again, the legislative analyst had much higher revenue figures and the governor ended up holding the legislature to a smaller overall revenue number. That second bullet is kind of a tongue-in-cheek reference to the fact that the legislature is also wise to the fact that the governor has repeatedly had a very conservative outlook on revenue, which he did do last year, and then the revenues that the legislative analysts had projected would come in actually did materialize, and the legislature had, unfortunately, not the opportunity to spend some of the money and set some of the priorities they wanted to. So there have been a lot of quotes by lawmakers recently saying that, look, we know the governor's approach on being ultra-conservative on these numbers. We've got a recovery now at hand. We want to spend on some key things that we think are high priorities. The governor over the last couple of years has prevailed in that sort of debate back and forth. And you look at the budget, particularly last year, it was virtually everything the governor wanted. It was hard to pick out what were the legislative successes. So we'll see what that track record looks like by the end of July.
And we're going to talk a little bit more about STRS as we go through it. We've got a number of slides on that. But I did want to point out that if you take some of the LAO assumptions about funding, I think one of the focuses for us is going to be to try to make districts whole in some way rather than having to fund the STRS employer contribution out of the LCFF funding. And that's going to be a big battle and a tough one over the next few weeks.
Yeah, a lot of these other kinds of issues like TK and Common Core implementation all get overshadowed by how profound the fiscal impact of STRS will be. This is a chart that shows you the state general revenue, the general fund revenues, basically what we just talked about, but in a graphic form. So you can see there the January budget proposal of the governor, and then both the the May revision and the LAO numbers higher than January, the LAOs being the highest.
So on the wall of debt, this chart's a little bit interesting. We've used it before, but just so you realize, what the chart is showing is how much of the debt is left in each fiscal year. It's not how much is being paid down in each fiscal year. So as you can see, each of these years, the governor's trying to make a big dent in the wall of debt, and by 15-16, he's got it paid down to zero. So as you'll see in 14-15, we've taken care of the deferrals. They're at zero. I think we have a slide on that coming up. Economic recovery bonds are at zero, and a few things are left, largely mandate claims and a few other smaller items, deferred Medi-Cal costs. All of those he plans to clean up in the next year or two and get this wall of debt down to zero. In terms of long-term liabilities, obviously we've talked a little bit about STRS and we're going to talk more about it. These are going to take a lot longer to tackle, and so you can see relatively modest sort of progress on the long-term liabilities, and there's still billions of dollars out there, even with the May revision and going forward. So STRS is actually only one relatively small piece of all of this. That's a large piece, but not the largest.
Very good. Here's an overview of the K-12 proposal in particular. And you see that small increase in Prop 98 funding he has, the CalSTRS piece we've talked about. The rainy day fund as it relates to us in K-12 is by virtue of something that's referred to as the Prop 98 reserve. And again, we're going to go into detail. He continues the full inter-year deferral buy down, which we'll have a chart on that. The LCFF has one minor change. It'll be significant to the districts that have what are called Provision 2 and 3 schools, having to do with it's connected to the National School Lunch Program. The biggest and only real augmentation the governor has over January is for the high-speed network, and that's all sort of rationalized by the need to do more with broadband capacity related to Common Core implementation. So I mean, very much dwarfs what the governor put into the budget for Common Core last year as a one-time shot of money. A lot of talk about doing that again, and this is basically the exclusive investment, the only investment that would help districts with that, and it's pretty small. Then you have independent study reform, and then we have a couple of minor changes on the mandate block grant.
So what's almost as important as what's in the May revision is what's not in the May revision. So as Kevin just mentioned, additional one-time Common Core funding is not in the May revision. We know some folks are going to push for it, but that's going to have an uphill battle in the next couple of weeks. We're not surprised that transitional kindergarten or mandatory and full-day kindergarten are not in there. As you know, Darrell Steinberg's pushing pretty hard for transitional kindergarten, but that's not looking terribly promising. We had hoped that with more funding, the governor might choose to address some of the problems with adult ed and CTE that they sort of kicked the can down the road on last year. But that has not happened yet. We still are holding out a lot of hope for CTE fixes, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. What's not in the May revision is any funding to offset the cost to districts on STRS, and so as we're going to talk about a little bit here, that eats into the LCFF funding you're going to receive over the next 8 years. It's going to be nearly just 20 to 25% of that funding to take care of STRS. And then finally, smalls, we are still looking to deal with transportation. As you know, it's an add-on to the LCFF formula, just like TIG is. But there are currently no proposals to do anything about a COLA for transportation or equalization. We know the funding currently doesn't impact districts equitably, and we would like to get some movement on those issues.
So into Prop 98. The 14-15 year, which is where we're really focused here, is estimated to be a test year one, which means that it's basically totally dependent upon what's going on with the general fund. That, you know, of the tests where you do a calculation, you're trying to figure out which of the Prop 98 tests generates the most amount of revenue, and because, of course, of the year-over-year growth, general fund growth in particular outstrips any other test, yielding 39.49% of the general fund for schools, being the Prop 98 minimum guarantee for 14-15. So we note that schools are still owed some $6.6 billion. That is inclusive of what they're paying in the current year. So after they get done doing what the governor is proposing for 14-15, that amount comes down to about $4.5 billion, but there is a still big chunk of money that's owed to schools under what's called maintenance factor. That is, whenever they suspend Prop 98 or have gone through a test 3 year when they give us less than we would otherwise get, there's an amount that comes back to us when the economy starts getting better. The amount of it that they have to pay us back is dependent upon just how good the growth in year-to-year funds actually are. So that leads us to the third bullet, which talks about a lot of volatility in determining what the guarantee is going to be in the situation where there's a big maintenance factor owing and a growing economy. The more it grows, the more they owe us. And so the growth was not as great as the governor, or at least for 14-15, the governor is projecting that the growth that year is not as great as he had previously anticipated, and it's why there's a big difference between what his projection is for 14-15 and the nonpartisan legislative analyst, and we'll talk about that in a second. So there you have it. It is about year-to-year revenue growth that's the driver on what we do get in the combination of the minimum guarantee and maintenance factor repayment.
Yeah, so a simple way to think about it is the governor says 13-14 was a spectacularly good year, but 14-15 isn't that great, so the year-to-year growth is a lot less. The LAO is saying, yeah, 13-14 was a good year, but 14-15 we think is a really good year as well. That sort of explains the big difference in Prop 98 funding.
So the governor makes multi-year adjustments in his Prop 98 minimum guarantee estimates over a 3-year period. He goes back to 12-13, adjusts the guarantee downward by $547 million, but then increases the 13-14 by $1.5 billion in one-time money. Obviously, that's the year we're in the middle of. So you go back and say, hey, there's a certain amount of money I'm paying you. Turns out I owe you more. When you go back and kind of take care of that obligation, it materializes in the form of one-time money, but is offset by that reduction in 12-13 and then in a lower reduced amount over what he proposed in January for 14-15, which drops by about $700 million downward from what he suspected he was going to have in January. So those two offsetting pieces kind of blow a hole in the optimism that we had. But again, we've got some potential good news when we take a look at what the LAO wants to do. So when you look at the two proposals, again, as I mentioned, the real focal point is on 14-15. What are the governor and the legislative analysts proposing for those 2 years? So if you look at the legislative analyst estimates, and we'll have a chart on this after this slide, but $313 million of additional money for 13-14, the year we're in, and then $2.2 billion of additional ongoing funding for 14-15. When you actually read the LAO's report, it says that the differences between the two are very minor, between themselves and DOF are minor. And that may be true in the context of the overall, $100 billion plus budget. But the governor says there's about 2.4% of overall growth in the Prop 98 minimum guarantee. What the LAO is saying here almost doubles that amount. It's an additional $2.2 billion of ongoing funding in 14-15 beyond the governor's May revised proposal.
Right, so a relatively small swing in the total revenue overcast means a huge swing in Prop 98 revenues, I think is the point we're trying to make here. So because the governor is showing $2.4 billion additional, but very, very little going to Prop 98. What the LAO is saying is actually 13-14 isn't quite as good as finance thought it was, and 14-15 is significantly better. Given that year-over-year revenue growth, we're scheduled to get a much higher maintenance factor payment in 14-15 under the LAO's numbers.
Okay, so here's a little graph that kind of shows the difference there. There's that $2.237 billion. And again, we're focused on the 14-15 fiscal year. And here are the changes over time. You can see the adjustment that he makes. These are color-coded, so you can see the governor's January budget in that sort of salmony pink color. You see where he is for 12-13, 13-14, and so forth. And then you can see his May revise where he drops down in 12-13. He goes up a little bit in 13-14, and then he drops down again in his estimate for 14-15.
So what's interesting here is the LAO has historically been more accurate than finance on their projections. And if you look at what the LAO is doing, we've got both the November and the May revised estimates, and you can see that the LAO thinks the trend is in the right direction. So that darker green line for May is above their estimate from back in November, and that's based on receipts that have come in since November. We were particularly strong in April, but strong all through the beginning of the year. So all of that is good news. The fight over it is when are we going to see the money? If the legislature takes the LAO's numbers, we see it early in this budget. If they don't, but the LAO still turns out to be right, then you end up with a whole lot of one-time money from 14-50 to 15 that they'll spend next year.
Okay. This is a chart that shows the deferrals. So the governor's really, his only modification for the K-12 deferrals is he is still buying it out, but he just changes because in his budget, in his May revision, you've got differences in what was ongoing money and what is one-time money. So he adjusts it so that he makes these little changes. The changes here bolded that you can see. So, for instance, that first cell that you see bolded numbers has 1813 as his January number. 1295 is his May revised number. So you can see these adjustments that he makes. The bottom line is at the end of the day, everything gets paid off in this budget year, in the 14-15 budget year.
So the rainy day fund, let's talk about this one a little bit. This proposal is a little bit different from the proposal we talked about in January. That one also had a rainy day fund and a Prop 98 reserve. The big difference is there was a compromise with legislative leaders, but more importantly, a new plan to sort of shift from this rainy day fund mentality to a, whoa, we've got some long-term debts. How do we pay those off? So as you're going to see, what we're calling the rainy day fund is only half a rainy day fund. It's mostly a plan to pay down long-term liabilities. So just to keep all the verbiage straight, the rainy day fund, now that we think about it, this part of a budget that's reserved for bad economic times is now called the Budget Stabilization Account, the BSA. And then there's also a Prop 98 reserve. That has another technical name, but I'm going to keep calling it the Prop 98 reserve because it's easier to think about that way. So what we are generically calling a rainy day fund proposal really has three main components. It has a real rainy day fund, that's the BSA, and that's eventually going to be up to 10% of general fund revenues in this sort of reserve for bad economic times. Then it's got a very large component of it that's just about discharging debt, and I'm going to talk about that here in a second, and STRS being a very good example of that kind of debt that they're trying to discharge. And then finally, there is a Prop 98 reserve component. So let's dig into this a little bit. The BSA, the actual rainy day fund, is going to be made up of funds that come from a calculation. That calculation includes 1.5% of general fund revenues for each fiscal year. So that's, again, a change from January. You might remember they were only talking about capital gains spikes. Now they're just going to take a straight 1.5% of the general fund. They're also going to calculate any capital gains spikes, but now it's over 8% of total general fund revenues. In January, it was 6.5%. Okay, now you look at that and you think that gets transferred to the rainy day fund, but it doesn't actually work that way. The way the new proposal works is after you make that calculation in the first bullet, you take half of all of that money and you use it to discharge debt obligations. And that includes Prop 98 debt, so STRS is one of the examples of those debts. So the idea here, quite cleverly, is to not just take this and make a rainy day fund, but to take a portion of the general fund each year and use it to start paying down long-term debts. The other half of the revenues then go to this rainy day fund, the Budget Stabilization Act, until it reaches 10% of the general fund. So then what's the Prop 98 reserve part? Well, only the capital gains spikes will go to grow a Prop 98 reserve. So it doesn't grow based on that 1.5% of the general fund. And the portion of the capital gains spikes that will go to Prop 98 is roughly the pro rata share of that spike, which in a test 1 year is about 40%. Could be slightly more if you have a high maintenance factor. In a test 2 year, it'll be a little bit lower than 40%. But probably easiest just to think about it as roughly 40% of the capital gains spike is going to go over to Prop 98 reserve. Now,
it'll sort of be the same ratio as every new dollar you would see in a really good year when you have stuff that goes up. So if it's a test 1 year, what do we normally get? About 40%. And if it's a test 1 year and it's really good, we would typically get test 1 plus any kind of overage for maintenance factor that's owed to us, so the proportion goes even higher.
And then in test 2 years, you're probably not going to be getting any money in the Prop 98 reserve, but I'll explain that here in a minute. Money will only transfer into the Prop 98 reserve once the maintenance factor that Kevin talked about, the 6.6 that I think was dropping to about 4.5, until that maintenance factor up through all the years prior to 14-15 is paid off. But you also won't transfer any money in any year in which maintenance factor is generated, right? So in a year, in many test 2 years, they generate a maintenance factor. If you're in a test 2 year and there's a maintenance factor generated, then there will be no shift to the Prop 98 reserve. And then explicitly, if Prop 98 is suspended, there's no shift to the Prop 98 reserve. So for the most part, you're looking at a Prop 98 reserve in years in which capital gains are high and it's a test 1 year. There might be a few other circumstances, but that's largely when it's going to be. Funds transferred in the Prop 98 reserve are deemed to meet the minimum guarantee for the year in which they're transferred, not the year in which they're spent. So if you have a really good year and money's transferred into this reserve, it counts towards the minimum guarantee that year. And then 2 or 3 years later, if you have a bad year and some money goes out to districts, it does not count towards the Prop 98 guarantee again. This is an important part, otherwise they get to count the money twice, and folks wouldn't be very happy about it. So overall, bottom line takeaway, there's probably going to be no money in the Prop 98 reserve for the next 5 years or so because they won't have paid maintenance factor off. and they're speculating that in 2 or 3 years from now they're actually going to have budgets where a maintenance factor is generated, and in those years there's no transfer. So for at least the next 5 years or so, we don't expect any money to go in the Prop 98 reserve. When it does go in, it's a slightly more modest amount than we originally thought. And then this fund, similarly to the rainy day fund for the general fund, gets capped at 10% of Prop 98 expenditures, so it'll never be higher than that. And then finally, we went back to look and see, well, what really would have happened with a rainy day fund if we'd had one in place for the last decade. And this chart simply shows that capital gains are up above 8%, probably more often than people thought. So back in 04, 05, 05, 06, 06, 07, in those years, it was all above the 8%. And then in the last few years, it's been above 8%. So it only dipped down in the deepest part of the recession. And that's an important point, excuse me, because I think a lot of folks thought it doesn't get up above 8% that often. In reality, it does actually get up above 8% pretty often.
They changed in the proposal. This was set at about 6.5%, the peak, where you take money off and stick it in a rainy day fund. They changed it to 8%, and we heard a lot of folks at the Capitol saying, yeah, moved it up to 8% because it'll happen a lot less often. Well, we actually were talking to some staffers today who I think were surprised at the data that we did that showed that it happens a little more than they think.
The other part that they didn't realize, I think, is that that 1.5% of the general fund, in most years where capital gains are above 8%, the capital gain spike is going to generate more money for the rainy day fund than the 1.5%. I didn't expect to see that, but it's actually the case in these years.
So just to sort of be clear on this, and this is sort of our first out-of-the-box conversation with anybody about this budget after we wrote the presentation, is you have the 8% that they're setting aside only in peak years, but every year they have to set aside 1.5%. What you're saying is that in the years that it hit 8%, it actually went over 8% by enough to probably cover the 1.5 and then
no, they're going to do both. That's the thing. So
yeah.
They're always going to do the 1.5, and then they're also going to do the 8% spike. What I think most of us didn't expect to see, and Jerry Shelton in our office ran the numbers, most of us thought the 1.5% of the general fund has got to be a larger dollar amount than that little above 8% part.
Oh, got it.
But the weird part is when it spikes by a lot.
Right.
And so that capital gain spike actually often generates more money than the 1.5%. I think most of us didn't expect that.
Got it.
So let's go to Ssda. So this is the single biggest proposal that's giving, I think, a lot of districts heartburn here, because it's going to put, as we're going to talk about here, a rather large obligation on districts without any proposal to increase funding to deal with that large obligation. So the idea is to eliminate the unfunded liability, which is somewhere around $74.5 billion, and to eliminate it over the next 32 years. They're going to increase contributions from 3 sources: the state's share, the employee's share, and the employer's share. The problem is the state is going to increase theirs by about $20 billion, employees by about $8 billion, and most of it, $47 billion, will fall on employers. And that's going to all be within Prop 98. The one way to look at it is the last bullet here, is that most of the new funding burden is going to fall on school employers. And it's going to be somewhere in the tune of, and we have to be careful here because we're talking about statewide average impact, not per district, somewhere around $50 to $55 per ADA for 14-15, and all the way up to maybe as much as $560 per ADA by 2021. That is a large chunk of the increase you all were hoping to get under LCFF to use for all sorts of purposes. And so the actual impact is going to differ with districts because your employer side contribution is dependent on compensation levels, and some districts have higher compensation levels than others. But as I said, there's no additional funding for this. So if you take the approach that, hey, you just need to deal with this out of your LCFF funding, if you think about that for a minute, LCFF LCFF funding was supposed to go up by about $18 million over the next 8 years. That's what the Department of Finance predicted for full implementation. Of that $18 billion, about $4 billion is what you need to pay for STRS. So that's a really large chunk, 20 to 25% of the LCFF growth. This chart here just shows what we were talking about before in terms of the percentage increase on the state employees pre and post the Pension Reform Act, and then finally on school districts. And as you can see, the school district line is the one that goes up quite steadily and for a long time compared to the other lines. So almost all of this burden is falling on school districts, and this chart here gives a rough dollar amount of the prior chart. So you can see you go from about a $347 million hit in 14-15 all the way up to about 3.5, 3.7, 3.8. It's a guesstimate right now, $1 billion hit by 2021. So almost all of this burden falls on you folks. And again, this was a burden I don't think everybody expected to get, and particularly didn't expect to get for 14-15. So you can plan around it, but the part here that's a little bit difficult is most of you have gone through your LCAP process for the most part. You did your planning and your budgeting for 14-15, and all of a sudden you learn, oh, wait a minute, I could be 50 to 55 bucks per kid off. I'm going to have to go back into that process for the first year and find that money. And for each, that amount's going to grow.
I want to point out, and Abe, you probably know the data of this, we talked about it yesterday. So at the bottom of this chart it says pre-PEPRA and post-PEPRA. That's the reform that was done just a couple of years ago.
Yeah, just last year.
Just last year. And so what they did is they went ahead and differentiated between employees who have been in PERS or STRS. In this case, this is a STRS reform. Prior to last year, either you did all your years of service. Those who are joining after they did the reform, which puts a hit on them that's a little more modest than it is on the employees that have been around a long time.
Yeah, so one way to look at it is with the Pension Reform Act, the new employees already got their pound of flesh taken out of them. And so they're reflecting that here. They're not going to hit them again in the coming years, but as much. But the old employees did not get that hit, and they're going to reflect a higher share going forward. Okay, so this is a point we've already made, that this hit is going to affect the funding districts expected to get over the next few years over LCFF, and it's got a particularly dramatic impact on hold harmless districts, county offices of ed, and those economic recovery target districts and basic aid districts. So these are the folks that we sometimes call the losers in the new formula, the ones that aren't going to see dramatic new funding because they have large percentages of English learner and low-income kids. Those folks then are going to take what they thought to be, a little bit better than flat funding that was going to make them at least as good as they were, as well off as they were in 07-08. Now with this STRS hit, I'm not sure they are as well off as they were in 07-08, even by 2021. So this is a problem that I think we're going to have to deal with some way, either financially to find some money to get out to districts and segregate it and say this is the STRS money, this doesn't count towards your LCFF money, or if not that, a big second best, at least some clarity that shows that districts aren't going to get as much LCFF funding as we had initially anticipated. And you're going to have to deal with that somehow when you do these sort of spending restrictions over the new money, and you go through the LCAP process. You're going to have to recognize that a big chunk is coming off the top for STRS.
So here is the slide where we get past these two difficult issues and talk about some of the fundamentals that don't change that much. So there's a COLA adjustment that's teeny tiny. It was 0.86. It adjusted down to 0.85. Again, the thing that we really like to point out is the second bullet underneath that first point about LCFF base grants. It says it affects LCFF target only. That means a COLA, instead of being a reflection of the additional money that you have to spend from one year, that you have to spend from one year to the next. This increases the target that you're chasing by that COLA amount. And then there's a selected number of categoricals, very few, where there's also an application of that COLA. And then here's what we've talked about before. We'll have this on at every budget workshop we do to show you what's going on with the base grant. So the base grants are moving ever so slightly. We're talking about, I think it ended up being 70 cents because the COLA adjustment was so minor, and it reflects it in these base grants per amounts.
So this is the old stack chart that we used, and again, all these are just reminders. These aren't things that change from January. But what you have here is how do you make up your entitlement target, which of course is the base grant, and then the grade span adjustments, supplemental and concentration, and the add-ons, and that all you all are familiar with now. In 13-14, then that gap funding for those of you whose entitlement target is above what your 12-13 numbers were. In 13-14, 11.78% of that gap was closed. That's what we're showing in the dark green there. And then the proposal, the $4.5 billion for 14-15, which is unchanged between January and May, would fill 28% of the new gap. So, so that's what the gap funding looks like. Again, for those districts whose entitlement target was above their 14-15 numbers, you're going to close your gap by an additional 28%. Remember that gap, as is shown on that chart, gets smaller each year. So next year, if we close the gap by 30%, that's probably a smaller dollar amount than $4.5 billion. And we've got detail on that, but we're not going to share that at the moment. We'll do that in July. And then these are the standalone categoricals that Kevin mentioned, some of which get COLA, some that don't. And there's a couple here that we identified that are proposed to be eliminated, which would be rolled into the LCFF. But some of the legislative committees are sort of pushing back on that. So that's in the May revision proposal. It was also in the January proposal. Not clear that that will end up in the final budget. The Provision 2 and 3 school issue that Kevin discussed a little bit earlier is this issue about Provision 2 and 3 schools are ones with high percentages of free and reduced lunch eligibility, over 80%. And there are some districts, some schools that have high percentages of kids eligible that just say, okay, every kid gets a free meal. Their obligation to count their students is different than other districts, and they don't have to recount every year. And the issue is, with the change to LCFF, those schools were in trouble because many of them have maybe 97% of their kids eligible, but they hadn't done a count in a couple of years. In their count, if they rushed to get one from parents who aren't used to filling these forms out, could have been low. So they've proposed a solution, which is you can use your 14-15 count, because at least everybody knew to go out there and try to get a good count for 14-15, in place of your 13-14 count, which might have been underrepresented. So if your current year counts are low, if you have undercounts for 14-15, this really doesn't solve your problem. But at least it gave you a little extra time to go out to your parents and try to get an accurate count. Going forward then, once you get a count, you only have to update it for newly enrolled students or students that go out of the program. You don't have to do a new count every year.
Very good. Okay, so this is a slide about the funding gap. And we're just sort of a reminder again that the governor, you know, he accelerates or puts in a huge amount of money, $4.5 billion into LCFF gap closure this year, almost double what he did last year. But he didn't shorten the number of years. Like if he kept a really heavy investment, you could argue that he's going to shorten the number of years of the phase-in. But you can tell the governor's worried about what his ability is going to be able to phase this in over time, maybe in future years, and issues like STRS are not going to help, where it's actually going to slow it back down again. So he's sticking with the 8-year prediction on phase-in. I think STRS definitely has an impact on that because how much money that you have year over year to work with is going to predict what you have to deal with. You know, the amount of money Prop 98 generates and what do you spend it on. STRS can consume an awfully big part of that as we get into future years, particularly if we have economic difficulties. So we just wanted to show you these 2 points.
Yeah, and I'm going to go through these next few slides quickly for purpose. The main point is the funding gap is still relevant for some reasons, that 11.78% or the 28%. And mostly it's relevant to K-3 grade span adjustment and to supplemental and concentration grant expenditures. This slide, we don't need to go through it again. Nothing changed in the K-3 grade span adjustment. The transition to 24:1. This is just a reminder that as you close the gap, you have to get ever closer to the 24:1 requirement. But remember that you can locally negotiate an alternative, and many districts have done that. One new thing since January, it's not in the May revision, but is that the administration has come out and said we're going to put a requirement into the 14-15 audit guide that if you have a locally negotiated alternative, you're going to have to document that, and your auditor is supposed to look for it. On supplemental and concentration grants, again, the gap closure is important because it helps determine your proportionality requirement. We're not going to walk through the 7 steps of the proportionality requirement again because that's not changed from January, but this again is just a reminder. And I don't want to spend a lot of time again on the expenditure rules, but the basic idea is that you take your 13-14 year as a base year. You have to at least say you spent your economic impact aid funds, but you can peg 13-14 expenditures higher. And if you say, well, I spent more on English learners and low-income kids in 13-14, the impact of having a higher 13-14 base year is that you'll have a lower proportionality requirement in subsequent years. If you peg your 13-14 base year low, then that means you're going to have a higher proportionality rate going forward. And we can talk more about those at the actual workshops if you can come join us. But for purposes here, trying to get through it in an hour, I think we'll just skip through it. I do want to mention, though, that whatever the requirement is, however restrictive you think the supplemental and concentration grant funding is, there is one big out, and that's for the district-wide or school-wide use of these funds. And this slide is just a reminder, again, nothing's changed since January, that under certain circumstances, and it's pretty flexible, you can take those monies and use them for school-wide or district-wide purposes. So they're not quite as restrictive as they seem. This slide just tries to play out all the different ways in which funding actually is restricted, even though it doesn't look restricted. So you're getting your money, most of your money, in one big pot. Remember, you don't even get a differentiation between base grant, supplemental, and concentration, right? All of this money just comes to you, and then you figure out how you're going to spend it in your LCAP. This slide is just a reminder that even though it doesn't look like it has strings attached, there are lots of things that look and feel like strings. So your required expenditures for the supplemental and concentration grants, your K-3 class size reduction, all of the other remaining categoricals that are kind of folded into the LCFF, and then long-term liabilities. All of those things are, in a sense, restricted funding. And then there's the funding that you're going to restrict on your own as you build your LCAP. So you're going to say, hey, I've got Common Core needs, I've got instructional material, professional development, assessment needs, etc. You are going to do things that are, in a sense, act like the old categorical programs or the old restrictions. So this slide is a big reminder to be very careful. Even though your funding doesn't have the same types of strings on it, the fact that you still have to do deferred maintenance, that you still have to buy instructional materials, all of that means this money just isn't there and available and on the table, and specifically if you're looking at collective bargaining. Okay, a reminder on the LCAP timeline. We've stripped out most of the slide and just talk about what's happening that's coming now. So most of you are well into your LCAP process. You got to be done by July 1st, and you got to do your LCAPs before your budget. Although the county superintendent has until October 8th to approve or disapprove an LCAP, remember they have to approve or disapprove budgets by August 15th. I take that to mean that virtually every county superintendent is going to try to complete their LCAP review by August 15th, not by October 8th. And then finally, just a reminder that you'll have to update your LCAP next year, and eventually the state board is going to have evaluation rubrics related to your LCAPs. And this is a reminder that the real requirement this year is just to have a budget that's aligned to the LCAP, which means you got to look at your LCAP, and for every expenditure you list in your LCAP, you have to be able to find it somewhere in your budget. If you do that, you're probably okay this year. And the key is, our last bullet here, you all need to be working with your county superintendent so there's no surprises on how they're reviewing your LCAP and your budget.
Okay. And then, so what I mentioned earlier about the only real augmentation the governor has between January and the May revision that's of any significance in the K-12 budget using Prop 98 dollars is this $26.7 million one-time use for a high-speed network that's about broadband capacity. The governor was sort of responding to what he heard about how the field testing was going on Common Core implementation. Obviously, there's a lot of clamor for another shot of money on Common Core implementation. This is sort of as good as he could get. $26.7 million pales in comparison to the original investment. So we'll see where that ends up. Independent study reform, there's a number of things the governor has in his revision. He had a January proposal that tackled this issue. He's made some modifications to that. One is that it would be course-based independent study, no longer requiring a teacher to have weekly live contact with students. That sort of piece of what he was proposing seemed to be overly burdensome, and so he ended up changing that. Allowing LEAs to claim ADA based on course completion, but does apply statewide excused absent rates. They just injected that piece about statewide excused absence so that you wouldn't have people that essentially were drawing down 100% ADA claim daily attendance when we know that that's rare. It's the exception, not the norm. And then it revises the definition of site-based blended learning option to allow LEAs to use universal agreements for students that take the same courses or course.
Yeah, and the whole idea here is just that there doesn't need to be a unique individual agreement with each specific student. If it's a course-based option, then every student can sign essentially the same agreement. The one big thing here is that the legislature is thinking about this. I think they agree with most of what the governor wants, but they're just thinking about it differently in terms of process. So they want to deal with it in a bill. There's SB 1143, which is a lieu bill. The governor would rather deal with it in the budget process, and we're not exactly sure how that will shake out. On adult ed, honestly, nothing really changed between January and May. This is one of those issues that I mentioned that we had hoped the governor and the legislature might look to resolve. They put an MOE in place for adult ed, but they really didn't resolve the issue of how are we going to provide this program in the future, and they really still haven't. The governor is talking about having an adult ed proposal by January, and so we'll see if that comes to fruition.
On the CTE Rock Rope issue, again, very similar, which is that the governor basically doesn't propose anything different in May revise. There's still a lot being worked on regarding this. What we're really trying to avoid is an effort by the governor who has sort of hinted at, well, maybe we just continue the maintenance of effort requirement where districts and county office of ed have to figure out rock rope funding, even though there's really not the money to do it. And what we really want to see is a change that accelerates the grade 9-12 grade span piece so that school districts in 14-15 have essentially all the money that LCFF would promise in that grade span for CTE and rock rope expenditures, but right now you're going to have to wait 8 years or more to get it. So we want to try to fast forward that allocation, and we're working on that with the legislature. On facilities, a number of observations, I should say. First of all, there's two very small changes the governor has from January. One is, and it's basically trying to scoop up different kinds of pots of money for certain purposes that are priority to the governor. First, a transfer of $211 million from existing bond authority that's dedicated right now to some programs to go into the new construction and modernization programs. Trying to get as much into new construction and modernization as long as those dollars last, and then pretty much the money will be all gone from the bond. And then finally, you know, in keeping with the Williams settlement, there's a dedication of $188.1 million. That's a familiar number because it's what they've been using almost every year to try to pay down the obligation under the emergency repair program that was part of Williams. On Prop 39, just a couple of things to note. First is the governor reduced the overall amount by $9 million, which is very small in the scheme of the whole pot of money. So there's $307 million of energy efficiency funds that will be available. Everything's really on track. The dollars are there. We worked very hard to make sure that small school districts have minimums, and so those are embedded in Prop 39, and you know those are there. There's a brand new website that the Energy Commission has launched. It covers a variety of different areas that are extremely helpful to districts, so you're going to want to check that out. And then we've had a lot of conversation about different nuances of Prop 39. We can go to the next slide. And we're going to talk a lot about this in our workshops that we do around the state in person. There's 20 of them, so they're meant to be a lot out there so small school districts can access these in person. But we're going to jump into the Prop 39 in a little bit more detail. One of the major things that I'm particularly concerned about are some of the interpretations of the term sole source. We think sole source means you need to just make sure you're not just picking one company and going with them without any effort to check out what else is out there. But we don't think you need to do RFPs on every single nuance of an energy project. That's ridiculous. You can do one RFP comprehensively for all your energy needs, and you can look at the companies that have the ability to meet your needs. If you want to only go with a consultant that then manages that whole process, yeah, you could do an RFP for that. But you're not going to have to be going down every nuance, every separate component of the project. And then on mandates, over to the right side of your screen, you can see that 6 mandates were added to the block grant without any additional funding. So the mandate block grant is what it is. They're not, some of them are in various dollar amounts that they might otherwise be, but you can see that the overall dollar amounts on the left-hand side of the screen remain unchanged. But go ahead.
Yeah, so on the politics of 2014, I think both Kevin and I will say something here. So on the Democratic side of the governor's race, clearly Jerry Brown is in very good position. His polling is at about 60% approval. He doesn't have any serious competition, obviously. And, typical Jerry Brown, he's not campaigning or spending any money right now. He's in the press plenty. It's mostly for stuff that makes him look good. There's a reason why he's been fiscally conservative for the last, well, he's been all along, but especially the last couple of years. His mantra is all about paying down the debt, and he is looking very strong right now.
Yeah. What little contest there is in the gubernatorial race, which is rather inconsequential, it is consequential perhaps for the Republican Party, but these 2 Republicans, and there are actually some more than 2, but the 2 most significant candidates are duking it out for what will be a teeny tiny share of the overall vote. In fact, Neil Kashkari, who most of the Republican establishment is trying to support against Tim Donnelly, who actually has bigger polling numbers. Kashkari's numbers are so low, they're actually lower than one of the other sort of no-name candidates that's a convicted, he's like a convicted sexual predator, and Kashkari's numbers are below his. So Kashkari's got to spend quite a bit of money to get his numbers up and to try to make a difference on Election Day if he wants to be the guy that goes up against Jerry Brown. I don't know what kind of a prize that is at the end of the day because the governor is just so strong in terms of his overall numbers. The down ballot races are the ones that are going to get the attention because very uniquely, of so many of the elections I've ever seen when there's been a gubernatorial election year, most of the attention is on the governor's race. When there is no governor's race really to speak of, that means people focus on the other races, and the state superintendent race is probably getting the most attention because Tom Torlaksson's got a very healthy competitor, both from a funding standpoint and just very aggressive in Marshall Tuck. He has the support of Eli Broad, a lot of well-moneyed interest, the charter school community, a couple of very prominent Democrat mayors, Antonio Villaraigosa in L.A., the mayor of Sacramento. And then probably a big jolt was when we heard that the Sacramento Bee, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the LA Times have all endorsed Marshall Tuck. So Torlaksson's got the backing of CTA and most of the major unions, organized labor will be there. I think in the end he wins, but it'll be quite a ride. It'll be a very interesting race. So the other thing that helped Torlakson out a lot probably were that there were some very controversial teacher accountability measures headed to the ballot, would have been supported by a guy like Marshall Tuck. And the fact that those ballot measures basically did not go forward, the governor was able to introduce a kind of a truce amongst the different folks relative to those ballot measures and the whole issue of teacher dismissal, means that the California Teachers Association is not going to be spending so much money on ballot measures or the governor's race, leaving it open for them to spend more heavily on the race for superintendent of public instruction.
As we discussed, the rainy day fund is going to be on the ballot. I'm not sure that tilts things in any particular direction, but we wanted to remind you that that's a major provision that's on the ballot. In terms of the legislature, both houses are getting new leadership. There's already a new speaker. Tony Adkins has taken over for Perez, and on the Senate side, we're going to have a new leader pretty soon here. But that one's a little bit trickier. Kevin DeLeon was announced by Steinberg as the next leader, but there was never actually a caucus vote. And so we do not have 100% clarity on what will happen with the state Senate, other than they will have a new leader sometime shortly here. And then the big dynamic here is Jim Brulte, who many of you know, a prominent Republican from years ago that led the caucus, now is the head of the state party, and he is working really hard to whittle away at that Democrats' two-thirds majority. It looks like the Democrats have whittled themselves away on the Senate side, and Brulte's working on the Assembly side as well with some success, partly because of the new open primary, where often you've got a couple Democrat candidates really going at each other, and not that ends up resulting in Democrats not having good feelings for each other after those races and not really helping each other out in the future. So some interesting politics going on. And that's all we have. I think we only have a couple minutes here for questions, but if folks have questions, we're happy to stay on for them.
Does anybody have any questions?
Shelley, do we have anything?
Not at this time.
Okay. Well, I'll take that as a no. Want to thank you all very much for tuning in, and we really hope we see you at the May Budget Perspectives workshops. We're going to be all over the state, and we'll definitely be somewhere close to you.
Check out the website at capitaladvisors.org. That's capital with an O-L, capitaladvisors.org, and it shows the whole listing of where the locations are going to be. And there may be two sets on there because we've got all the listings for this May Revise series, and I think we may even have the July final budget series up as well. You're obviously welcome to both. Thank you very much. And
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Shelley, for setting this up.
Thank you.